The January 1970 headline read, quote, 25,000 Chicago Jews rally outside the Palmer House in Chicago, end quote. My grandfather, who was here, Saul Silverstein, brought this bit of ancient Chicago Jewish history to the forefront of an exchange we shared last week. I had vented to him my frustration with the lack of outspokenness coming from the Chicago Jewish community in light of recent stabbings and car ramming attacks in Israel. His storytelling invited me inside a reality very different from my own. According to his version of events, in early 1970, Chicago Jews recruited 25,000 local Zionists to protest the visit of then French Prime Minister George Pompidou after his decision to suspend the sale of Mirage jets to Israel. My grandfather explained that it was in the wake of this rally that Chicago Jewish activists emerged and set their sights on Soviet Jewry. The strength of Chicago Jewry left its mark on the city, but more strikingly reflected the resolve and muscle of a diasporic community when it is united. Proud of his generation's legacy, my grandfather continued with his story until he noticed my attention had lapsed. His nostalgic pride inversely reflected my now boiling disappointment. I explained that the number 25,000, I still say it to myself, was simply beyond me. It surpassed my 21st century realm of comprehension and had eclipsed my frame of reference. I could not fathom a reality where 25,000 Jews from the same shtetl would first and foremost link arms, and for Israel no less. My grandfather had colored a moment in time when the Chicago Jewish community did not view Israel as some politically radioactive buzzword, but rather a pillar of Jewish life that transcended bickering over settlements or Bibi. 1970 versus 2015. The contrast between these two eras is what I ask each of us to evaluate for my brief moment behind this microphone. Chicago Jews of 1970 were driven by at least one of two tangible memories. The younger demographic latched on to the uplift of Zionism in June of 1967 after the Israelis put their finishing touches on surrounding Arab armies. And the more senior members remained soaking wet with memories of the Holocaust, either as survivors or as traumatized onlookers from the US. These two events fashioned the character of a generation. The 1970 Chicago Jew was certainly tougher, but more pertinent to our analysis, the Jew was coated with unparalleled pride. It was an era where Jews revered the illustration of the strong and heroic new Jew, the kind poetically invented by Chaim Nachman Bialik, and animated to life by Beitarniks like Menachem Begin, kibbutzniks like Ben Gurion, and palmachniks like Yitzhak Rabin. The influx of Zionist pride had young Chicago Jews admiring Israeli soldiers alongside their favorite Chicago Cub. The number 25,000 loosened my jaw because it reflected an era I deeply wish to have experienced. In 2015, Jewish life seems less defined by pride and more so by guilt. According to many of my peers, to show love for Israel is to first and foremost undress and embarrass her. Criticism of her few flaws in place of admiration of her many feats is fundamental to this new definition of support. To me, the greatest casualty of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has been the historic subversion of young Jewish pride. Israel is really no different than she was in 1970. Her enemies, however, have learned to plot her defeat from within the 25,000. They have learned how and where to cast a net on young Jews, vilifying their pride and swapping terms like Jewish miracle for colonial occupation. Young Jews leaving local Jewish institutions for public universities are pressed, often at the expense of their social status, to reconsider what propaganda might have been fed to them at their Jewish day school, summer camp, or Shabbat dinner table. A manufactured guilt has given birth to Jewish organizations that tear our much-needed cooperation at the seams. And by no coincidence, anti-Israel groups like Students for Justice in Palestine have aligned themselves with unprecedented cooperation and finances. Ironically, their unity is fortified by our guilt-ridden divisiveness. The question I've been left to wrestle with is what exactly warped the essence of the 25,000? More constructively, how can we resurrect or reinvent this pride that once stirred 25,000 to the corner of Wabash and Monroe? I believe, through several of my own experiences, that this pride is not yet extinct. The supply is short and endangered, but not yet depleted. We're at a pivotal point, and just like all pivotal points in Jewish history, leadership must be cultivated. If this quiet pride can be restored to a powerful status, perhaps we can usher in a new and golden era. Stand With Us has assumed this holy assignment. In May of 2014, I was a third-year law student at DePaul University. One morning that spring, I was contacted by Asaf Kronberg of Stand With Us. He asked me if I could travel from DePaul's Loop campus to the Lincoln Park undergraduate campus to help the pro-Israel students with what he called a problem. The pro-Israel students had recently discovered that DePaul's Students for Justice in Palestine chapter had launched a campaign at the school to divest from mutual funds that invested in companies that do business in or with Israel. Asaf gathered it would be beneficial to have a law student in the room as the young students brainstormed. When I entered their meeting, I saw a group of 20 students huddled around Asaf and Brett Cohen, the National Campus Director for Stand With Us. The students had engineered a war room at the resident Jewish Center at DePaul, and Asaf and Brett had essentially returned for their Miluim service to mentor and empower the students into action. The student leader designated tasks to each person in the room, and I was asked to author an op-ed in the DePaul student newspaper and engage an anti-Israel student at the law school in a debate. The room was filled with anxious energy, but the anxiety was slowly overrun by enthusiasm that reflected their love for one another as well as their cause. As the meeting continued, I slowly made my way to the back of the room, where I observed the scene for a short moment. From this removed perspective, I experienced an emotion akin to what my grandfather had recollected from the 1970s. Jewish pride, while on a micro level, was alive in this small Zionist incubator in Lincoln Park. Stand With Us is vintage 1970, just blended into a booklet that's appealing to the 2015 reader. Fundamental to Stand With Us is an unapologetic stance, seemingly utilizing the same megaphone as Soviet Jewry activists from the 1970s. Stand With Us is proud of Israel, her character, her history, her innovative spirit, and her progressive intonations. Likewise, any guilt is quickly healed. What 17-year-old Jews leaving CJHS, Idacron, Deerfield High School, Camp Ramah, Camp Shai, USY, BBYO, the list goes on. What they need to hear is that Jewish pride is not meant to be stored away in their dorm room closet, but rather worn daily and with conviction, as we just heard so beautifully articulated by the two students before me. Stand With Us is attempting to return the shield to my generation, full well knowing that confident pride is our greatest asset in the fight against BDS and all ensuing manifestations of anti-Semitism. I am a volunteer with Stand With Us. In this capacity, I have led seminars for students to know their legal rights on campus and have trained licensed local attorneys to understand the legal landscape associated with BDS. Unfortunately, we cannot ensure that this mission, this holy assignment, is accomplished by volunteers. Stand With Us needs more Asafs, more Bretts, more Vitas, and more Peggies, since more of these leaders will directly produce more moments like that I experienced at DePaul, and it will more directly produce pride. I ask that you each support Stand With Us as it recruits and trains our next crop of much-needed leaders. Without such an effort, our pride will surely fade with the preceding generations that understood its essence so vividly. With that said, I ask that you please go ahead and fill the pledge cards out on your seats. What you do now impacts whether my generation and those generations that follow in our footsteps will project the same pride for Israel. Stand With Us board members and students are making their way through the aisles to collect your contributions. Thank you, and Am Yisrael Chai.
Good one.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Here's like your donations. If you'd like to make one.